At the time of the Titanic's sinking in 1912, it was one of the most costly losses of life at sea in peacetime history. More than 1,400 people lost their lives, and since then, the story has entered popular legend. It might surprise you to know, though, that things could have been far, far worse, and if things had even happened just a little bit differently, then many more people could have lost their lives that night. From a broken wireless set to a sinking rescue ship, here are 4 ways the Titanic disaster could have been far deadlier. Number 1. Officer Murdoch makes a mistake. Titanic struck a glancing blow off the iceberg slightly enough that it caused damage that slowly flooded the ship over the course of 2 and a bit hours. But if First Officer William Murdoch had done things even a little bit differently while trying to avoid the iceberg, Titanic could have sunk in minutes instead. The nature of the damage the iceberg inflicted to Titanic has been the source of debate for decades. When Titanic's lookouts and bridge first spotted the iceberg, they had less than 40 seconds to get their ship out of harm's way. But when you are steering a ship that weighs in excess of 50,000 tons, that can be a bit of a tricky prospect. You see, ships don't steer like cars from the front. The rudder on an ocean liner like Titanic is located at the very back or stern of the ship, and an immediate and urgent turn will actually cause the ship to pivot at its middle and swing its back out, not unlike drifting in a sports car. This means that if you're trying to avoid an object, you can still hit it, even if the front of your ship, or the bow, is pointing in the direction that you actually want it to go. Titanic's crew on watch that night well knew this fact, and it was First Officer William Murdoch who ordered the ship's wheel swung hard over to get the bow pointing away from the iceberg. It was just too late though, and the ship had only just begun to turn when she hit the berg. Then, even in the intense stress of the moment, and with only seconds to think, Murdoch did something remarkable. He had the foresight to order the ship's wheel be swung hard in the opposite direction. This was a maneuver intended to kick Titanic's stern away from the iceberg as it swung around, and it worked. The iceberg only damaged about 200 or 300 feet of the ship's bow. But what if Murdoch hadn't had performed this maneuver? Instead, Titanic's hull would have contacted the iceberg at the bow, and it would have scraped along the side of the ship, possibly causing even more damage the further along it scraped. We know now that the real-life impact opened up the ship's hull in a series of small incisions, and Dr. Robert Ballard noticed that the ship's hull plating, or its skin, was forced open in gaps of only about 1 to 6 inches wide. That's 2 to 15 centimeters, in areas where the iceberg contacted the ship. If Murdoch hadn't have swung the stern out of harm's way, the iceberg could have opened up many more compartments along the ship's hull, flooding the ship much faster. And even more terrifyingly, damage to all the boiler rooms along the hull or the generator room could have seen the ship's power go out in only a matter of minutes, plunging it into darkness. How long the ship could have been able to stay afloat for with this amount of damage is just a matter of conjecture, but almost definitely not long enough to get the lifeboats away safely. This amount of damage could easily have resulted in the loss of almost all of the ship's passengers and crew, about 2,200 people. Number 2. The sea is choppier. The Atlantic Ocean is one of the wildest, toughest seas in the world, with winter gales that, over the centuries, have claimed hundreds, if not thousands, of ships. During storms, waves can reach as high as 70 feet, or 20 meters mid-Atlantic. It can be a scary place. At one point in maritime history, travellers looking for passage across the ocean to the New World were really gambling with their lives simply by making the trip. Back in those days, the trip took a month, but by the time of Titanic's introduction, the voyage took little over 5 days. Things had changed. The ships were much bigger too, but then the Atlantic could still strike at random. In 1910, the Lusitania was mid-Atlantic in a storm when she was battered by a monstrous 7-story tall wave that washed out as high up as the bridge. It is a vast, violent, deadly ocean, so it's all the more remarkable that on the night that Titanic sank, the sea was a flat calm. These conditions were described well by famous survivor Violet Jessop, who said, "Greyish skies replaced sunshine, calm sea, perfect serenity for miles. Grey sky deepening into haziness as evening fell made the water look like molten silver as it caught the soft beams of brilliant starlight. After a night of calm seas and floating mists, the wind rose to an icy keenness, cutting through our numbed bodies. The sea's surface was perfectly flat that night, like a mirror, a condition which meteorologists suggest happens perhaps once in a lifetime." This created a problem for Titanic's lookouts and crew because it meant that there would be no waves breaking on any icebergs ahead, which would usually produce a telltale white foam and make them a little easier to see. But these calm conditions also played a huge role in ensuring the survival of hundreds of passengers when they took to the lifeboats during the sinking. After Titanic struck the iceberg, the crew began to make ready the lifeboats, a process which took a good deal of time. In fact, it wasn't until an entire hour after the collision, when Titanic's bow was already well down in the water, that the first boat began to be lowered away. These first boats were famously lowered half full, as passengers seemed reluctant to evacuate at first, but as the night progressed, and Titanic's situation became more obvious and dire as the bow dipped lower and lower into the water, the boats began to fill up. But even when full, the lifeboats had a good degree of freeboard, which is the term used to describe the total height of a boat's top from the waterline. Because of the night's flat calm, the boats were lowered and floated away safely. However, it's not hard to imagine what might have happened if the weather was a little bit different. For one thing, if the sea was bigger and a heavy swell was rolling through, Titanic would have been rolling and pitching as she sank, probably slowing down the process of lowering the lifeboats in the first place, as they swung out away from the ship one moment and crashed back against it in the next. Then the big wooden boats would need to be filled and lowered and somehow remain together. But in a heavy, wavy ocean, it would have been difficult or even impossible to maintain order, and it's likely the boats would have been scattered to the wind. Having been blown so far off course after Titanic sank, it seems impossible to think that the rescue ship Carpathia would have been able to find all of the boats, leaving their occupants to the mercy of the icy cold air. This alone could have resulted in the deaths of hundreds more. But if the big wooden lifeboats had it bad, it's the collapsible boats which would have suffered the most. Titanic carried 4 of these little boats known as Englehart-type collapsibles. They were essentially a flat wooden barge with canvas sides that could be raised up to create a hull of sorts. They were almost impossible to sink because of their enhanced flotation, but once Titanic sank, these little rafts would have been battered by big waves that likely would have overwhelmed their fragile canvas sides. The passengers inside would have been assaulted by icy water from the start, with many succumbing to the cold. On the night of the sinking, Collapsible B actually floated from the ship upside down, and thanks to the calm conditions, about 30 men survived through the night balanced on top. If the sea were just a bit heavier, they would probably all have been overcome and lost. Number 3, Carpathia strikes an iceberg. I've made a video studying Carpathia's actions that night in detail. The heroic crew under the command of Captain Arthur Rostron sailed at full speed for Titanic's location after receiving her wireless distress calls. Rostron knew full well that he was sailing directly into an ice field where huge icebergs loomed in the dark, and on such a moonless night, it would be extremely difficult to spot the icebergs ahead. Regardless, Rostron posted a dozen men to the very front of the ship to keep a sharp lookout and ordered that all steam be put on so that Carpathia would arrive at Titanic's location as soon as possible. In doing so, though, Rostron actually took a fair gamble with his own ship and its passengers. In fact, Carpathia did almost run directly into an iceberg that night, but it was spotted just in time by the ship's second officer, James Bissett. With around 740 passengers aboard and 300 crew, Carpathia could have been in serious trouble if she too encountered an iceberg that night. Built in 1903, she simply didn't have the safety features that Titanic did. In fact, she carried as many lifeboats as Titanic, even though she was just a fraction of Titanic's size. The reasoning for this was actually explained by Captain Rostron himself, who said that the ships are built nowadays to be practically unsinkable, and each ship is supposed to be a lifeboat in itself. The boats are merely supposed to be put on as a standby. The ships are supposed to be built, and the naval architects say they are, unsinkable under certain conditions. What the exact conditions are, I do not know, as to whether it is with alternate compartments full or what it may be. That is why in our ship we carry more lifeboats, for the simple reason that we are built differently from the Titanic, differently constructed. If Carpathia had hit an iceberg hard enough that night to begin flooding, it is difficult to say how long it would have taken her to sink exactly. If she sank quickly, say in under an hour, the crew may not have had enough time to lower away all of her boats, leaving hundreds to freeze in the water, which that night was 28 degrees Fahrenheit or negative 2.2 degrees Celsius. Assuming she had enough time to launch all her lifeboats and get all her passengers and crew away safely, there remained the fact that the nearest help would still be 4 or 5 hours away, or more, and now rescue ships would be needed for both the Titanic and the Carpathia's survivors. Some victims of the Titanic disaster had initially survived the ship's sinking, but in the lifeboats succumbed to the cold night. Adrift for hours on end, Titanic's 706 survivors and Carpathia's 1,040 passengers and crew would have had to have held on to mid-morning, and many more would have suffered and been lost, thanks to the extreme cold. It's frightening to think how close Carpathia could have come to disaster that night, and Captain Rostron himself even recalled that when day broke, I saw the ice I had steamed through during the night. I shuddered and could only think that some other hand than mine was on the helm during the night. Number 4, the Marconi wireless isn't fixed. When she departed Southampton for her maiden voyage, Titanic had aboard her one of the most powerful wireless sets afloat, but the technology was still in its infancy. In fact, many ships didn't even carry a wireless set and still relied on lamps, flags, and rockets for communicating. Because of her size and passenger capacity, however, Titanic carried 2 wireless operators who would be expected to deal with a large amount of passenger radiograms throughout the voyage. John Jack Phillips, 25, and Harold Bride, 22, worked in alternating shifts to contact distant radio stations and other ships to pass on messages from passengers to loved ones or business associates waiting for them in New York. The 2 men had been hard at work tapping messages out when, late at night on the 4th day at sea, Phillips began to have difficulty with his machine. The men weren't actually White Star Line crew, but were employees of the Marconi International Marine Company, and the organisation had trained its men not to attempt repairs at sea for fear of causing further damage. Instead, it was recommended that the machine be left alone until arrival in port, where a technician could properly assess and fix it. Instead of this though, Bride and Phillips worked all night to get it up and running again, so that finally, about 5 or 6 hours later, Titanic could again begin transmitting messages, and the 2 wireless operators would begin to catch up on the huge backlog of passenger messages waiting for them. That was Sunday morning, and it was that very night that Titanic struck the iceberg. And thanks to the repaired Marconi wireless set with its huge range, Phillips and Bride were able to coordinate a rescue, reaching Carpathia, the Mount Temple, and more, ensuring that these ships would be sailing en route to rescue Titanic's passengers. But if the wireless set was still not operational when Titanic hit the iceberg, things could have been very different indeed. With no way of reaching ships beyond visual distance, Titanic's passengers would have taken to the lifeboats, but without any ships coming to their rescue. They'd have drifted for hours and hours with their occupants succumbing slowly to the cold, scattered by the choppy seas that developed the next morning. It's easy to imagine that the newspapers in New York the next week would have instead proclaimed that the Titanic had disappeared with all hands lost, likely sunk by an iceberg. Maybe a lifeboat or 2 would have been stumbled across by a passing steamer in the weeks and months to follow. But Titanic, and all 2,200 of her passengers and crew, would have simply vanished into thin air. It's thanks to the efforts of Jack Phillips and Harold Bride that more than 700 people survived the sinking of the Titanic that night, but things almost could have been very, very different. Ladies and gentlemen, it's your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, like and subscribe to the channel. Every bit helps, and I put out a new video every week, so you'd hate to miss out. If you'd like to support my work, please subscribe to me on Patreon, or you can sign up for a YouTube membership for perks like early access, behind the scenes, and many more. You'll find the link in the description below. As always, stay safe, stay happy, and I'll see you again next time.